will be moderated by Professor Leszek Buszynski, visiting fellow, the Strategic and Defense Studies Center, Australia National University. Professor Buszynski, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm filling in for Ambassador Giorgio Aliberti, who was invited, but sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, I think if everyone on the panel kept the microphone close to their mouths, I think this problem would not arise. We've had this problem previously where I think some of the panelists kept the microphone away from themselves and we couldn't hear what they were saying. So please keep the microphone so close to your mouth so they can hear what you're saying clearly. And I will endeavor to do the same. So this is the final session, and we have to be very careful about time because we're running up against dinner, and we don't have the liberty of some of the other sessions where they can go on for well over time. And the panel is about, the session is about the South China Sea in multilateral forums. And there are two themes here that we will be exploring. One is the South China Sea in multilateral forums, how it's been discussed in the UN, ASEAN, AD, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and so on. We have a second theme as well, and reference to this was made in our very last session, and that is the COC, the Code of Conduct, how ASEAN-China talks on the COC and the implementation of the DOC have progressed. We have our regular four speakers plus our discussant, and we'll start with Professor Carl Thayer, who's from the University of New South Wales in Australia.
Thank you, Les, and I'll let the audience know when I drop the microphone so you can hear me. I'm wondering what I do to get my slides up. Oh, there they are over here. Okay. I've chosen 5 case studies, and they're listed there. And as Les was saying, I examined a research question: do multilateral settings help restrain different parties' behavior and provide a conducive environment and mechanisms to foster the management and resolution of existing disputes? Most of my case studies are chosen because I was given copies of internal ASEAN draft documents prior to the conclusion of the multilateral meetings that I'm talking about, and so I could judge the difference between the discussions in ASEAN versus the outcomes. And the one exception is my first case study, and that's those are the case studies, but you'll now see them in turn. So the first one is the infamous one in July 2012. I wasn't leaked any documents because the ASEAN ministers met. They assigned Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam to do a draft joint statement. They drew up a 132-page draft, including 2 paragraphs on the South China Sea. And in that draft, and it was controversial, the Philippines wanted Scarborough Shoal, which had, and I'm using a military term, been invested, surrounded, and occupied by the Chinese. And Vietnam had just passed the law of the sea of Vietnam, and the China National Offshore Oil Company immediately offered oil blocks on the Vietnamese side of its exclusive economic zone. They wanted that mention. Now, how do I know what happened? At the ASEAN ministers' meeting retreat that evening, the 4 countries that did this draft presented it. I was later given a transcript of the entire conversation that must have been taped, and I was provided that, and I published on it. I have a word-by-word account of what occurred there, and I obviously can't go into that great detail. The chairman was Cambodia under Ho Nam Hung, its foreign minister, and at this particular meeting, there were 3 paragraphs of the 120-odd in that joint relating to the South China Sea. And paragraph 16 mentioned the situation in the affected shoal and disputed area, exclusive economic zones, and continental shelves. Those are the 2 issues that the Philippines and Vietnam raised. All ministers spoke in alphabetical turn, And then individually, the ministers of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam spoke. And at their conclusion, the ASEAN chair, Hor Nam Hong, disagreed with each and every one of them and kept saying, we have no other recourse, I will walk out of the meeting. He later was good on that and did, and that's why there wasn't a joint communique. So they had this interchange. Then Indonesia and Singapore, after the break, tried to get a broker a compromise on the words, but the Cambodians refused it. So in the end, Cambodia walked out, as Hor Nam Hung repeatedly threatened, and ASEAN had issued no joint communique. Now, allied to this were reports that Cambodia had passed documents to China and had consulted, but we'll leave that aside. So I'm talking of internal disunity in a multilateral setting has harmed progress. The next is the third. I got to get looking at the proper screen. My second case study is the third ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus with their dialogue partners in 2015. And an impasse was reached over whether to mention the construction of the artificial islands by China in the joint statement. China and Russia objected, and the reference was dropped. And the United States, with the support of its friends, as well as ASEAN, made the decision that no statement was better than one that avoids mentioning artificial islands and militarization. So no joint statement was issued directly by the ministers who were there, but the South China Sea, in very bland terms, was mentioned in the chair's statement. So that ends case study 2. Case study 3 is the special China-ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Kunming, hosted by China and Singapore, who was the ASEAN country coordinator for dialogue with China itself. Going into the meeting, it was agreed that there would be a press conference at the end, but not necessarily a joint statement, a press conference. And prior to this, the ASEAN ministers had agreed on the media statement, and that Singapore, as the country coordinator, would present it at this press conference. Now, during this special meeting, out of the blue, the vice minister from China showed up with a 10-point consensus and wanted everybody to agree. And ASEAN was upset by what they called arrogant behavior of this particular minister. They rejected it. They instructed Singapore not to attend the press conference, and Vivian Balakrishnan got on a plane and left right away. And then China blocked the release of this media statement by getting Cambodia to withdraw consensus from it. So we have Cambodia acting twice now in multilateral settings not to allow that to go through. So then the ASEAN ministers took the decision that each one of them was free to make their own statement. And Malaysia immediately released to Agence France Presse the prior agreed media statement. China then went to Laos and sought clarification. Is this official? And then Laos had to say, no, it's not. And so Malaysia was instructed to rescind this media statement, which is what occurred. And then China now claims there was nothing official by ASEAN at this particular meeting. And Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam later made their own individual statements. And what was the offending statement? And this is quite groundbreaking if you read any of the ASEAN communiques since 1992. In the beginning, yes, we're going to have a summit with China and everything's going to be fine and we look forward to it. But we also cannot ignore what is happening in the South China Sea, as it is an important issue in the relations and cooperation between ASEAN and China. That directly contradicts repeated statement by Chinese officials at that time that the South China Sea was not an issue with ASEAN. It was only a bilateral issue amongst the claimants. So the cat is out of the bag that at one point, ASEAN actually got some teeth into a statement and told China its behavior was an issue with ASEAN itself. The next is the midterm meeting of the non-aligned movement, and here I've seen the communications that were written between the ASEAN chair protesting what happened there. Now, this is held in Baku in Azerbaijan, and ASEAN, as a member of the non-aligned, is recognized as the regional body for Southeast Asia. And every year they issue a final document, we can call it a joint statement, whatever. They issue a final document, and there is a section on Southeast Asia. And ASEAN wanted then to update this to include developments in the South China Sea. In 2016, China intervened and no update occurred. And again in 2018, the same thing happened. So ASEAN was left saying, we made some new changes in our wording. We want to have it reflected. Some members show concern about activities in the South China Sea that may undermine trust and threaten regional stability. So the ASEAN section was omitted from the final declaration. So there we have the next multilateral meeting to see whether that occurred to anything. So what was the offending paragraph? So in the final declaration, paragraph 526 on Southeast Asia, this is pure ASEAN speak, but it was not included, that they wanted freedom of navigation, implement the Declaration on Conduct of Party, early conclusion of an effective DOC. They've been doing this for the last 4 years. We established hotline and queues. We've heard that's come on board. They took note of the concerns expressed by some leaders on land reclamation and activities which have eroded trust and confidence, increased tensions in the region, etc. And they wanted non-militarization and self-restraint. That is boilerplate ASEAN diplomatic position, yet because of Chinese intervention, it was not included on that. Then we come to the 32nd ASEAN Summit last year, my final case study. It was held in Singapore. And to prepare for this meeting, a zero draft of the chairman's statement was drawn up. And then this was now 25 points, and it's to be considered by all the ministers. They make amendments, they put suggestions in for change, and then we go. Of the 25 points, 7 related to the South China Sea. 16 annotations were made from 6 members, and Cambodia topped the list with 44%. It's not an issue of direct concern, but yes, they did that. And so I wrote an article called Consensus by Deletion. In all those paragraphs, they were just taken out and forgotten. They didn't appear, they weren't reassembled, they weren't rejigged and attached to the other paragraphs, they were just gone away with completely. And one of those points was the Philippines and Vietnam got together and wanted notice of the Arbitral Tribunal and welcome its findings, which was extraordinary because only Vietnam at that point hadn't even mentioned the Arbitral Tribunal. Everybody else in ASEAN was quiet and later called it diplomatic and political processes itself. So that's the summit. And then in the end, what was included, and this is again standard, ASEAN's freedom of navigation and overflight, implement the DOC, negotiate with China on a code of conduct, practical, you've heard this all before. So what they got in there was what they had already been agreeing for years, and anything new was not included. So let me conclude. The writ and the description for this session was very positive. I should find positive results of multilateral. But my case studies show compelling evidence that multilateral forums did not moderate either Cambodia's behavior, 3 examples I gave you, or China's behavior. The artificial islands got built and militarized and advanced weaponry put in place since then. So multilateral forums did not moderate China's behavior with respect to the disputes in the South China Sea, nor did multilateral forums mitigate major power rivalry within the multilateral forums, the ADMM plus meeting. Internal divisions within ASEAN, Cambodia, exacerbated by China's interference, undermine the ability of multilateral forums, and I've given you 4 of them, different settings, to moderate state behavior as evidenced by the 3-month standoff we've seen between Vietnam and China this year in waters near a Vanguard bank. Now, as Les alluded to, we were asked to update, and I want to keep this very brief and not go over coals, but the standoff resulted with this Chinese geologic ship with Vietnam after several weeks of issuing either no statements or statements that didn't mention where it was occurring or what was involved, calling for international support. The US State Department issued 2 statements accusing China of bullying and coercion and interfering with oil and gas exploration and threatening energy security in Southeast Asia. But when the US met with its allies, Australia and Japan, in the Trilateral Security Forum, this was watered down to complaints about advanced weaponry, militarization, etc., but not the naming China. European Union issued 4 paragraphs and even offered its facilities to adjudicate and help if countries wanted, but probably not. But 3 new themes have emerged which are being presented by the international community. Concern over the disruption of oil and gas activities in Vietnam and the region, which are long-standing. That China and the Philippines are named as being responsible for implementing the Arbitral Tribunal Award, so pressure is being put on them, Philippines in particular, to follow through. And finally, whatever the COC becomes, it should not adopt provisions that threaten the rights under international law of third parties in the South China Sea. So these strong new 3 points are the tip of the spear. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, for bringing to our attention the things that are normally hidden from public view. And next we have Dr. Tuan, who is Director, Deputy General of the East Sea, South China Sea Institute of the one of our hosts, that's the DAV, Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. So over to you.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank the organizer for giving me this opportunity to speak with you, my research about the relations between the United Nations General Assembly, the UNGA, and the South China Sea. So my main research question is what role the UNGA can play for the peace and security of the South China Sea. And I found that the UNGA can have some role in promoting peace and security of the South China Sea. So to begin with, I start with the concept of what is a threat to peace and security of the South China Sea. And I think today we have already discussed those threats to peace and security from the political and security threats. They include the very complicated territorial disputes in the South China Sea, the complicated issues of maritime demarcations among littoral states, and also the struggle among major powers, especially between the United States and China. So I just borrowed his map from the CSIS to show you how complicated the dispute of the South China Sea there, but I do not want to go into detail about it. But when I look at another aspect, I saw another threat to peace and security of the South China Sea. The first thing is that I found out from the environmental perspective, there are some other threats. The first one is the climate change with some prominent features such as the sea level rise or intensity of natural disasters, the pollution, and also the islands building activities. The pictures on the right side of the screen is just the projected futures of Bangkok and the Mekong Delta by the year 2015. That has been recently published by the Climate Change Center. And in that projection, most of Bangkok and Mekong Delta will be submerged under the high tide. This result is now controversial because there are some doubts about the calculation methods of the research. However, they showed that how insecure the coastal cities around the South China Sea to the climate change. Another issue is the pollution, and littoral countries to the South China Sea produce the largest volume of marine debris in the world. Number one, you can see from the map, is China. Then the next one followed by other countries, including Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. And another threat to the peace and security of the South China Sea is the island building activities. This picture I took from an article just published last March in the scientific reports that name the title of the article is Evidence of Environmental Changes Caused by Chinese Island Building. And it concludes that the artificial islands building by China in the Spratly has killed 60% of shallow reef habitat in the affected areas. And those island building activities is damaging an area of 1,200 square kilometers, or that is equal almost twice size of Singapore at the heart of the South China Sea. And I think we should remember that this area is also home to the world's most important coral reefs, and also it is one of the most biodiverse areas in the world. I look at another aspect, it is economic, and I also see some threats to the South China Sea peace and security. They include unsustainable economic activities, including mass terrorism, tourism, overfishing, or illegal, unreported, or unregulated IUU fishing, piracy, or coercion or intimidation activities, also threatening the safety of sea lanes, and of not only communications, but also commerce through the South China Sea. And with that, in the picture, you can see that how important the South China Sea to the world of commerce. The picture on the right side, up on the right side, it is how important a crude oil that going through the South China Sea. And the one that below it on the right is also the network, cable network of that go beneath the South China Sea, that is actually link the South China Sea to the rest of the world. So when I look at the UNGA, I found that it is a good platform to address the issue of peace and security of the South China Sea. I do not say that it is ideal place, but I think because it is good, because there is some, although there is some limits, but the UNGA has a lot of leverage to address the peace and security of the South China Sea. First of all, it has the largest number of member states, that is 193 countries. It has 6 main committees that cover large areas, including disarmament, international security, economic and finance, social, humanitarian, and culture, special political and decolonization, administrative and budgetary, and legal affairs. It also has a lot of funds, programs, and other subsidiary bodies on various domains. Particularly the UNDP and the UNEP that deal with development and environmental issues. It also has relations with other UN specialized organizations, including the ICLOS and the WTO. And according to the charter, the UN can discuss any questions or any matters within the scope of the charter, or even relating to the powers of any organs that provided in the charter, only exclude those which have been dealt by the Security Council. Therefore, it is a good place to address the threats to South China Sea from the 3 aspects that I mentioned earlier, that is political and security, environment, and economic areas. However, when I look at the South China Sea in the UNGA, I see that it has a very limited footprint. Some countries, mostly Vietnam, the Philippines, and China, circulate note verbals on their positions whenever they believe there was a violation of international law or threats to peace and security at the South China Sea. And when I look at the UN library, it shows those notables, at least from the 70s. Occasionally, some leaders of the government raised their concerns to the South China Sea, about the South China Sea at the general debate of the UNGA. For example, the very last debate in September, Deputy Prime Minister of Vietnam has raised such concern. And sometimes the South China Sea appears on reports of some subsidiary bodies of the GA. However, the South China Sea, when mentioned at the UNGA, is often focused on territorial dispute, on piracy, or environmental issues. However, the report on environmental issues of the South China Sea is fairly outdated. When I look at the library, they are about 10 to 15 years ago. So with that, I come to what the UNGA can do for the South China Sea. I think in political and security areas, the most important thing the UNGA can do is to uphold international law, especially the UNCLOS, in their activities or resolutions. It should also promote the spirit of dialogues and peaceful settlement of dispute. The UNGA should also continue to be the platform for countries to raise concern. By doing so, the UNGA will indirectly promote peace and security of the South China Sea. And in an extreme case, when other peaceful means have not succeeded, countries can also ask the UNGA to support a request for the International Court of Justice to give advisory opinions on dispute, like the case of Chagos recently. In environmental protection, UNGA can help raising environmental awareness. The funds and programs under the UNGA, like the UNDP or UNEP, should have UN-sponsored projects or send technical experts to help littoral states in protect their marine environment and fishes. I know that some of those projects have been done, but this type of project is needed more. In the terms of economic, UNGA can help countries surrounding the South China Sea to share best practices in economic development and sustainable use of resources. And I think global campaigns for development, such as the Millennium Development Goals or the recent Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, are very important, because they set the targets for countries in economic development and direct them into a sustainable path. For the successful help by the UNGA, I think there should be some condition for it. The first thing is that there should be a universal respect for the rule of law and the role of multilateral organizations. Countries should understand the need for peaceful settlement in good faith. And they should also have common understanding that peace and security of the South China Sea is the interest of not only South China Sea claimants, but the whole world. And they should have a comprehensive understanding of threats to the South China Sea, not only from the political or security perspective, but also from other aspects, including the environment and economic. They should also understand that resolutions of the UNGA, although that they are non-compulsory, but they show the general opinion, so they can carry moral weight. They should also understand that the UNGA is the largest group of countries with very diverse interests and a long list of issues to deal with, and also complicated procedures. So therefore, I conclude that we should not expect a quick fix, but gradual help from the UNGA in all three areas, that is political and security, environment and economic development, for a better peace and security of the South China Sea. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Next, we have a presentation from India, our Indian participant, Dr. Udai Bhanu Singh, who is from the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. So over to you.
Hello. Is my voice audible? First of all, thank you for this invitation to me to come to this very prestigious conference. Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam is an organization with which IDSA, my institute, has an MOU with, and I'm very glad to be part of this. There is a advantage in being amongst the last speakers in the day. Whatever important had to be said has already been said, so I will not have to give too much of detail on this subject. But the outline of my paper, I would be talking on what are the multilateral forums in which Vietnam participates and what way in which Vietnam can utilize these multilateral forums. And the two forums that I have in mind are United Nations and ASEAN, ASEAN-related forums. To begin with, the recent South China Sea developments, which you have seen that China sent its survey ship, Haiyang Dizi 8, escorted by other ships, to conduct activities in the South China Sea or the East Sea, and violating Vietnam's economic EEZ and continental shelf on 4th of July this year. In 2014, China had made similar incursions, the Haiyang Shiu 981 oil rig standoff, which took place then, and earlier in 2011, when China had sent ships. Chinese ships intruded in two blocks, 0.51 and 0.61, and then moved on where India's OVL, our company, along with Petro-Vietnam and Russia's Rosneft, we have been drilling for oil there. And so there were interests of India also involved there. China, by utilizing its artificial islands this year, has been able to serve as logistics hub, which can stay away from its nearest Hainan island for longer duration. Thereby, it poses a new challenge for Vietnam. China's assertive regionalism has been seen in recent times. China's economic and military rise, growth of nationalism, all these have prompted the quest for new security architecture within the region. Beijing's One Belt, One Road, with ASEAN states joining in, some of the ASEAN states joining in, has weakened ASEAN centrality to an extent. The master plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025 requires an annual investment of 110 billion, which explains why the Asian Investment Bank is so important for the region. Vietnam's possible solutions. Of course, bilateral negotiation is one way of dealing with the problem, and some of the ASEAN countries have chosen that route. But I don't think that this is the only or desirable option that is available to ASEAN countries. There is, of course, another way, which is to raise concerns with friendly states, and that I think the diplomacy of Vietnam has undertaken. The other most important way in which this can be done is to use the media more effectively and to reach out to the international press and the print media for this purpose. UN diplomacy is another way in which the problems of the South China Sea can be addressed by Vietnam. The UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council are the obvious choices. And then legal recourse is possible through ITLOS, International Court of Justice, and the PCA. And what will be seen next year is how effectively ASEAN diplomacy is used by Vietnam, which includes the ASEAN Summit, the East Asia Summit, ADMM+, ARF. These will be ways in which Vietnam will be addressing this issue. If you look at the background, in 1992, ASEAN adopted the Declaration on South China Sea, urging restraint. 2002, when ASEAN-China signed the non-binding DOC. And then 2012, ASEAN failed to produce a joint communique. That was one point at which ASEAN was criticized for not being effective enough. 2016, ASEAN-China agreed on the CUES. And then in 2017, ASEAN-China agreed at Manila to a negotiating framework for the COC. ASEAN-led institutions have been effective in various ways, and the latest development in this area has been in June 2019, when ASEAN released the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. I think this is a very important development which has perhaps not received enough coverage. This brings to the fore ASEAN's and Vietnam's point of view to an extent on what needs to be done in this region. At the outset, the document points out that it is not aimed at creating a new mechanism or replacing existing ones. The aim is to strengthen ASEAN's community building process and strengthen ASEAN-led mechanisms to better face challenges such as the South China Sea. India has been quite active in its relations with ASEAN. It's a member of the East Asia Summit, and we held the India-ASEAN Summit earlier, and this has been indicative of the interest that India has taken in the work of ASEAN. The East Asia Summit is the other important forum which is ASEAN-led, in which leaders resort to negotiating and articulating policy decisions from a regional platform. At the 14th East Asia Summit, which was held in Bangkok only the other day, it recently mooted the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative to enhance maritime security. Prime Minister Modi of India has proposed also a seminar on maritime security and cooperation next year in India in Chennai. The 13th East Asia Summit, which was held in November 2018 in Singapore, it emphasized the importance of maintaining and promoting peace, security, freedom of navigation, and overflight above the South China Sea. It noted the progress of a single draft COC negotiating text. Of course, the region is vast, and as has been mentioned earlier by earlier speakers, that there is sometimes a divergence of opinion on what the Indo-Pacific connotes. But despite that, there is a common view, I think, emerging within the region, at least within ASEAN, and India supports the ASEAN view on it being inclusive term. we are looking at a convergence of views amongst the various actors in the region. The ADMM Plus is one of the most important ASEAN-led forums, and membership includes the ASEAN plus the 10 dialogue partners. Forum for regional defense leaders for security dialogue, and forum for practical steps to promote military cooperation. The leading word is practical. These are practical terms for promoting military cooperation, including joint military exercises, which ADMM helps with. ASEAN Defense Senior Officials Meeting Plus at SOM prepares the ground for ADMM Plus. The 6th ADMM Plus, the defense ministers exchange views on recent developments in South China Sea, emphasize need to enhance mutual trust and pursue peaceful resolution of disputes in accordance with international law and UNCLOS. ARF, of course, is an older forum, and it is also one which could play a limited role in dealing with these problems. The expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum has emerged as a venue for East Asia Summit members to address common cross-cutting maritime issues and challenges. With regard to the United Nations, there are maritime disputes coming to the UN through various organs, UNGA, UN Security Council. The Commission on the Limits to the Continental Shelf is another important body which addresses these issues. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea was addressed in the previous session at great length, was created by the mandate of the 3rd UNCLOS. The International Court of Justice plays a different role, and that could also be used for addressing issues of South China Sea. The UNGA and the UN Security Council are other areas, organs of the United Nations which can be utilized. Vietnam Foreign Minister Pham Minh Minh said, multilateralism is facing acute challenges and called for strengthening of the United Nations. The UNGA is, of course, the principal organ of the United Nations based on sovereign equality of all members. I think this is where lies the strength of the UNGA. The general debate is another important feature which is utilized and has been utilized by some of the members of the UN. ITLOS has an independent judicial jurisdiction over any dispute concerning the interpretation or application of UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is not a UN agency, but an intergovernmental one located at The Hague, it has an observer status in the General Assembly. As evident from the 2016 ruling on Philippines and China, its rulings are binding but not enforceable. India's position, because I come from India, I would like to briefly mention what our position has been. India follows a consistent approach on South China Sea, articulated on several occasions. It's not a party to the South China Sea dispute, but 55% of our trade passes through South China Sea and Malacca Strait. India's ONGC Videsh Limited engaged in oil and gas exploration in blocks off the coast of Vietnam since 1988. So we have a long history of involvement here. China has raised concerns, but India has conveyed that these activities by Indian companies are purely commercial in nature. Freedom of navigation, overflight, and unimpeded lawful commerce in the international waters, in accordance with international law, notably the UNCLOS, is what India supports. Peaceful resolution of disputes without resorting to threat or use of force. India welcomed the declaration of conduct and hopes for early adoption of code of conduct. India and Bangladesh settled their maritime disputes, their maritime boundary dispute using the mechanism of UNCLOS. In conclusion, the 2016 PCA verdict gave a potential fillip to the rule of law in the South China Sea. It was an opportunity afforded to ASEAN. The ASEAN states, especially the claimant states, need to show greater resolve in responding both militarily and diplomatically in the South China Sea. Once that happens, the gains on the multilateral front would become more visible. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, for your presentation. Now we move from India to Jakarta, and we have our Indonesian presenter here, Mr. Ibrahim Almuttaqi, who's from, if you're familiar with Jakarta, one of the notable think tanks there is the Habibie Center, and our Indonesian presenter is from that center. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and very good afternoon to ladies and gentlemen. So I'm very mindful of the fact that I'm the second last speaker before dinner, so I'll try not to take up too much time and use up too much time to present my paper, which is on the title of the South China Sea within the War for Peace multilaterally. So that is obviously a reference to the former Indonesian foreign minister who spoke about the need to wage peace in the region. So by way of introduction, we were all very well familiar with the importance of the South China Sea, but the thing that I'd like to highlight in my paper was this idea of the South China Sea as a flashpoint. And it's something that we often seem to take for granted in these days. What's quite interesting is that if you look at the literature, you find that this characterization of the South China Sea as a flashpoint only really emerged after 2009. And more interesting is how, since the PCA ruling of 2016, there's been this common acceptance that tensions in the South China Sea have started to calm down. So this seemed to be a kind of paradox for me, which is that this flashpoint period appeared to be a strange anomaly, sandwiched in between the preceding period and the preceding period. So if prior to 2009, the literature describes the South China Sea as an area of low-level combustible agitation, and latterly it's been described as a period of improving ASEAN-China cooperation, how do we explain this paradox? And it raised a number of questions in my mind. So that led to the research question and the hypothesis that I put forward in the paper, which I think is in the conference proceedings in front of you all. But the main point was that the hypothesis was that rather than constituting a separate break from the previous and preceding period, the flashpoint actually marked a continuation of what some scholars describe as the South China Sea as a zone of relatively stable peace. And I'll go into that a little bit more in the presentation. And what I further argued was that whilst this zone was tested to the limits, the solid conditions conducive for peace that had come about by the ASEAN approach of multilateralism was such that war remained unthinkable even during this period of heightened tensions and alarmist headlines of looming conflict. So my paper borrowed heavily from Weizmann, who wrote in 2010, and he had argued that war is very unlikely in the South China Sea. And he credited two key factors. Number one was elite interactions, characterized by track to diplomacy and personal networks between the leaders. And the second factor was regionalization, which is looking at the wider ASEAN-China rapprochement, including economic integration and interdependence. So for elite interactions, the thing that's quite interesting to highlight is how, if you look at the literature, they often say how leaders in China are not accustomed to building personal networks with their counterparts in Southeast Asia. And yet, because of the ASEAN mechanisms of the regular ASEAN summits, the EAS, the ARF that my previous speaker spoke about, this is a very noteworthy achievement that the leaders of ASEAN and China have developed very close relationships. So we've heard in the morning how President Duterte has met with his Chinese counterpart a number of times, and even the Indonesian President Joko Widodo has met, in the first 2 years of his office, met Xi Jinping 5 times. And in terms of regionalization, we've seen a number of achievements notched up by ASEAN and China. So from the early 1990s, Beijing engaged in soft power diplomacy, whilst ASEAN engaged in something that they called constructive engagement. And what we saw is that there have been a number of achievements. So for example, China became a dialogue partner in 1992. They joined the ARF in 1994, and they took part in the first ASEAN Plus 3 in 1997. And what was interesting is how one of the literature mentioned, if in the 1990s, China was very reluctant of all these multilateral platforms, by the 2000s, they had become a more proactive actor in these multilateral settings. For economic integrations, we've seen how trade has increased between the two sides from the 1990s to 2005, including the introduction of an ASEAN-China free trade agreement. And all of this meant that the cost of engaging in war with one another was such that there was a powerful incentive not to do so. Otherwise, it would undermine the benefits of economic cooperation. So this was all written by Weizmann in 2010. And what I wanted to see in my paper was, did this still apply in the Flashpoint period from 2010 onwards? So I looked at the various parameters that was identified before, and to see how it worked in 2010 to 2018. So what we see, for example, in terms of elite interactions between ASEAN and China, the leaders of ASEAN and China continued to conduct bilateral visits with one another, whether that be leaders from ASEAN to China or Chinese leaders to the ASEAN capitals. What was interesting was how the increased tensions in the South China Sea did not stop the leaders from meeting with each other. And interestingly, there was a number of cases where immediately soon after a standoff or a dispute, the leaders would actually meet. So for example, just a few months after the PCA ruling, we saw President Duterte meeting with Xi Jinping. Similarly with Indonesia in 2016, there were a number of standoffs in the Natuna waters, and that did not stop President Jokowi flying to Beijing in September of that year. Another very interesting development was how during these visits, we saw a number of historic developments. So for example, when Xi Jinping came to Indonesia, he was given the rare opportunity of speaking at the Indonesian parliament. And the same thing happened with Vietnam when the Chinese leader spoke at the National Assembly. I'll skip this one in the interest of time. But for ASEAN-China regionalization, what we see was, again, more developments in their relationship. So in 2012, China established its mission to ASEAN in Jakarta. They appointed their ambassador to ASEAN. We have the commemorative summits and etc. And if you look at, say, the ASEAN-China statements, there have been a number of statements between the two, whether at the summit level or at the ministerial level. So this did not only continue during this Flashpoint period, but they actually increased over the years. And what was significant was that they didn't just focus on the South China Sea, but looked at the wider ASEAN-China relationship. And another interesting development was how, if I mentioned in the 1990s, China was a reluctant member of the multilateral framework, and by the 2000s, they had become more of a proactive actor. It was interesting how in 2018, Beijing declared itself as a champion of multilateralism. Similarly, with economic integration, we saw that trade again continued to increase between the two sides between 2010 and 2018. And also, this, going back to the initial argument, how it provides a powerful disincentive for ASEAN and China to go to conflict, this was still the case in 2018. And there was a headline when Mahathir came to power in Malaysia, and a Chinese official sort of warned or reminded China that there are, 134 billion reasons not to rethink the Chinese investment. It could be argued that it goes the other way around as well, that China has the same billion reasons not to go to conflict with ASEAN. And with China committing billions of dollars to ASEAN countries through initiatives such as the AIIB, such as the BRI, it's difficult to see why Beijing would want to jeopardize the improving cooperation between ASEAN and China. So to conclude my presentation, if back in 2010, Weizmann had argued that war was very unlikely in the South China Sea, it could be argued that despite the increased tensions and disputes over the past few years, this still remains the case. Back then, Weizmann credited elite interactions and regionalization as the key factors. And what we saw was that during this Flashpoint period, they not only continued and survived, but they actually increased and intensified. So we often criticize the ASEAN multilateral approach. We often say that ASEAN is not strong enough in standing up to China. But it cannot be denied that despite being tested to the limits, the ASEAN approach has been somewhat successful in preventing these tensions from escalating into conflict. And as we heard yesterday from the former Secretary Lee Liu-ming, the DOC and the COC, they're not meant to resolve sovereignty issues between the claimant states, but more to do with preparing the grounds for negotiations between the sides. And I think the same can be said with the ASEAN approach. So with that, I'll hand back to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And now I turn to our discussant. That's Professor David Capie from the Victoria University of Wellington. Now, very often in these discussions, New Zealand gets left out. Not this time, however. David, over to you.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, that's working. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can I just start by following the others and acknowledging and with thanks the very kind invitation from the Vietnam Lawyers Association and the DAV for the chance to be here as part of this conference. It's always a pleasure to come back to Hanoi and to see some old friends and meet some new ones, and it's been an honor to share the stage with some very distinguished experts today and some really good presentations. I'm not going to provide a New Zealand view on this topic, but I'm really going to try and pick up some of the broad themes that I think came through the presentation and perhaps pose a few questions. And I'm very conscious that we are in the graveyard shift of the day. You've all done incredibly well to still be here, but I'll try and be relatively concise and to give you a chance to ask some comments to the presenters as well. I think first, one of the themes that comes through all of the papers very clearly is that no issue has done more to undermine ASEAN's unity and weaken its influence on regional security over the last decade than the South China Sea. And I think all of the papers do a really excellent job of cataloguing the difficulties that the disputes have caused for multilateral cooperation in Southeast Asia and also beyond. ASEAN, of course, as has been mentioned, issued its first statement on the South China Sea in 1992. But in the last 7 years in particular, we've seen the dispute really take its toll, hurt ASEAN's image, its effectiveness, and lead even, I think, long-term observers and friends of the association to speculate about the possibility of a deep fracture. I think the second thing that's really interesting with these papers is that while they all acknowledge these challenges, they all face them head on, they come to very different conclusions about, about what impact and what difference multilateral forums have actually made to the overall regional security picture in the South China Sea. And you'll have picked that up in the 4 presentations you've heard. The first presentation from Professor Thayer was certainly the bleakest assessment. He might say the most realistic. Essentially, he said multilateralism has done nothing to moderate China's behavior, nor did forums mitigate great power rivalry. And at the other end of the spectrum, I think Dr. Ibrahim is perhaps the most optimistic, saying that despite the criticism of ASEAN's multilateral approach, the South China Sea is, quote, a zone of relatively stable peace even today. And then I think we've got Tuan and Dr. Singh perhaps fall somewhere between the two on that spectrum. So why is that the case? Why is it that we have these people are looking at the same events, the same facts, the same activities, but they're interpreting them very differently? And I think partly it depends on what you're actually expecting multilateralism to deliver. Are you hopeful for a comprehensive solution of the dispute and the underlying sovereignty claims? Or are you simply hoping to manage military tensions and to encourage transparency? Or do you have more limited goals to look for opportunities to build functional cooperation, like the ones Tuan talked about in a lot of detail, talking about environmental cooperation, climate change, tackling plastic waste and the like? Or is there a different benchmark that you're pursuing, the absence of a region-wide war, a great power war? And I think if you're looking at the more ambitious end of the spectrum, it's very hard to make the case that regional multilateral processes have done much to resolve these disputes. And I tend to share the perspective offered by Professor Koldenova this morning when she said that there are structural limitations for regional institutions when it comes to managing great power politics. The sheer power asymmetry in Southeast Asia, and as this balance of power continues to shift towards China, these challenges are only getting harder. But what about some of these more limited goals? For what I would call glass half full analysts like Dr. Ibrahim, multilateral settings deserve credit for sustaining the long peace that Asia has enjoyed. Despite the tensions, he argues the South China Sea has never been a flashpoint, a potential trigger for a regional war. And he points to progress, as does Dr. Singh, on modest CBMs, for example, hotlines, and the agreements like queues. And I think we could perhaps go further here and talk about some of the activities that have taken place in the context of ADMM+, concrete activities like military exercises around themes like HADR. All of this has been valuable, but at the same time, I think it's hard to point to what neo-functionalists would have talked about in the old days of European integration as a move from soft or low politics cooperation to deeper forms of cooperation. Now, I'm a little skeptical about some of the claims made about economic interdependence and the roles of elite interactions and skillful track 2 diplomacy. I think there's some big claims about causality that are still out there and that are up for debate. I think realists might put a bit more emphasis on the balance of power and deterrence. But when we think about some of the deep economic connections that have been discussed, we can also think about the way that they have been an inhibitor of multilateral solutions. And here I'm thinking about some of the recent work on the way that interdependence has been weaponized. The opposite of the interdependence coin is, of course, vulnerability to economic coercion. And is economic dependence on China one reason, for example, for the muted response to the PCA decision from other ASEAN members or perhaps other states in the region? And I think you can make the argument that multilateralism maybe multilateralism has been a check on war, and I think that's an if, but it's apparent, I think, from all of the papers that regional institutions have failed to cope with what Thomas Schelling called the diplomacy of violence, the use of coercion short of overt force to change the facts on the ground. And Andrew Scobell, I think here last year, talked about the South China Sea as a slow intensity conflict, arguing that it's lack of escalation and slowness undermines the prospects for meaningful dialogue and negotiation. So what could have been done differently? Are there different ways to build solidarity? What comes through in some of the papers that many of the features of regional multilateralism that were touted as strengths in building a Southeast Asian community in the early years and were so strongly endorsed as ASEAN moved to a point of centrality in regional architecture in the 1990s, have now begun to be seen to be more problematic and indeed vulnerable. The expansion of ASEAN for 5 to 10, the taking on of an increasingly broad range of economic, political, and security issues, including through the plus mechanisms, has brought with it much greater pressure from outside powers and a host of diverse domestic political variables that have complicated decision-making. And the consensus principle has repeatedly allowed 1 or 2 countries to block what would have otherwise been shared positions on key issues. And I guess I would say rather than what we're seeing is that China has become more comfortable with regional institutions, is that actually China has been very successful in neutralizing ASEAN from criticizing it on core issues as it sees them. And so it begs the question that's been raised from time to time, and that is whether or not there is any constituency to revisit some of these decision-making models. For example, is the ASEAN minus X formula that's been talked about in some contexts worthy of closer inspection? A third theme I think that the papers raise concerns the relative effectiveness of regional and international multilateral settings. And I remember a few years ago there was a very interesting survey done by CSIS in Washington of ASEAN elites that asked them which forms of dispute resolution processes did they have the most confidence in. And they had a lot of confidence in national processes. And then the next level was global institutions like the ICJ, and only then were regional institutions. And I couldn't help but think as I listened to the speakers, I wonder what that survey might look like today if you took it. And I think this raises the question of what is the link between global institutions and multilateral processes. And Tuan, I think, makes a really plausible and interesting case for thinking about taking the South China Sea to the UNGA. But what's the relationship between going to the UN and some of the regional processes that have also been talked about? Remember, the Philippines was criticized by some, for example, when it pursued its arbitral tribunal without consulting widely as it was seen in Southeast Asia. Dr. Singh poses a very interesting question in his paper about whether the PCA ruling in 2016 has served to incentivize moves towards a COC. And actually, one of the things that's striking about all the papers is actually how little they talk about the COC process and negotiations. And so it would be interesting to hear from the speakers just what they think are the prospects for a legally binding, substantive code of conduct to come out of the ongoing negotiations. And then just finally to close, if it's a cheekily broad question, we heard in one of the earlier panels, we heard about these competing visions of regional order, about the different models for a free and open Indo-Pacific, the different Chinese visions that underpin BRI and new arrangements like the AIIB. India has its own take on Indo-Pacific as well. And so far, ASEAN has been skillful in navigating through this complicated terrain and emerging with its own outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And I think it's one that's important for small states like New Zealand that have a preference for inclusive frameworks for cooperation. But if the assessment that I'm hearing in the papers is correct, the status quo is being transformed in really significant ways, both in terms of facts on the ground, but also institutionally. And I'd be very interested to hear from the panelists what they think these competing visions of regional order might mean for the future ASEAN-centered institutions and cooperation on maritime security issues. If we were to look 10 years into the future and to be invited back to the 21st anniversary of the South China Sea Conference, what would the landscape of regional security cooperation on maritime issues look like then, I wonder?
Thank you. We're running out of time. We don't have that much time, but I would like to ask our panelists some questions. short questions that demand short answers before I open the floor to everyone, because I think we should focus on certain key issues that emerged from these presentations. Firstly, to Carl and our two ASEAN presenters, what do they expect of the negotiations for the COC? And I ask this question because some of my contacts within an ASEAN foreign ministry, not Vietnam's, have told me that China has been cleverly maneuvering ASEAN into the position where ASEAN would accept a statement of general principles and declare it victory. And if that's the case, how would the ASEAN countries react? How would Vietnam react? And over there, how would Indonesia react? Now, to our Indian participant, Dr. Singh, a question about India's commitment. It arises very often in discussions about India. How serious is India in being committed to this part of the world, the South China Sea? Because it is often said that India's strategic interest in the South China Sea is really related to the situation along the border with China. And if that improves, and if negotiations between Modi and Xi Jinping continue to be harmonious, then India's interest in the South China Sea will simply lapse, and India's interest in multilateralism will decline. So these are the questions I pose to you. Short answers, please.
Well, thank you, Les. What do we expect from the COC? Well, some of you know I haven't read the advanced copy of the original single draft negotiating text just before it was released and wrote about it, so I'm in some position to explain it. It leaves open, first of all, before I get on to the general principles, the legal nature. Vietnam suggests national legislatures approve it, and they give the copies to the ASEAN Secretary General as a depository. Brunei suggests bringing it up to the UN General Assembly every year for a resolution. Okay, the scope, the geographic scope has not been determined, and I believe that China does not want Scarborough Shoal or the Paracel Islands included, so that's important. And then the role of third parties is not even mentioned because China sees them as outside. But the general principles in the single draft negotiating text, one, it states what we all know, the very first up, it does not solve sovereignty disputes. Two, it's there to promote under 2C, the central part, it's divided into three: introduction, big part, and conclusion, basic undertakings. And they borrow really from the UN and UNCLOS, duty to cooperate. And it's very, very detailed on all these suggestions for cooperation, including on marine resources, military exercises. Of course, China's contribution is you must give advance notice of military exercises in case any country should object. We will cooperate on marine resources, but on oil and gas, the only companies that should be involved are China's and local countries, not oil companies from outside the region. So these have to, from general principles, kind of be resolved. All the countries basically under cooperation put down the Declaration on Conduct of Party and its 5 areas of cooperation. Indonesia added illegal, unregulated fishing, and Cambodia put in connectivity, whatever that means. And then very detailed, it's there as a code of conduct to prevent disputes, to mitigate them, and to resolve them. And they have great hotlines and communications. There's a lot of practical things in there. But if it's not legally binding, then where do we go? So that's a short answer.
Thank you. Dr. To?
Hello? Yeah. I think the question is short, but the answer I don't think is short. Because I think we have discussed that kind of questions for several times and have yet come to any kind of conclusion yet. The thing for COC is that, yeah, do we think that we need the COC? I think we need a COC, but with some condition. The first one is that what is the relations between the COC and the DOC? We have the DOC already, so what is different of the COC? The second one is regarding the scope of the COC. So what the areas it will cover in the COC, it is the whole South China Sea, or just only part of it. The next one is about mechanism. The DOC has no mechanism to follow. So what should be the mechanism that we have for the COC? And the very last one is what will happen when there is someone that violates the COC. I don't think that we will have COC at any expense when those very core questions have not been answered. So the way to move forward, I think, is that we should rely on international law, peaceful discussions, so that we should have a COC that is effective and that is in accordance with the UNCLOS. And in that COC, I think, as we discussed, I think for the whole day, that the South China Sea is not only the sea for the littoral states, but outside countries also have interest on that. So how the COC can solve that interest of the outside country, I think is also the issue that we need to be considered. So with that, all those, when they solve all the questions, I think the COC can be had.
Thank you. Ibrahim, what's the view from Jakarta?
So for someone who gave a very optimistic presentation just now, it might be surprising that I have a more pessimistic impression of the COC. If we're realistic, the COC will not be what we expect it to be, this binding agreement that will resolve the tensions or the disputes in the South China Sea. But the COC will most likely be an imperfect document. But this has been the ASEAN way. The DOC was not perfect, the COC will not be perfect. But I think the view of ASEAN is, or the view of Indonesia is, we would rather China be a part of something rather than completely excluding them. If we want to have peace in the South China Sea, we need to have all the different parties on board. And it doesn't make sense to try and isolate any single party. We saw with the PCA ruling, for example, the PCA ruling was comprehensively in the decision of the Philippines. And it completely squashed all the claims of China. And China responded by saying, so what? No one's going to enforce it, no one's going to implement it, we're just going to walk away. And I think for Indonesia and for ASEAN, we took the lesson from that, which is you need to engage, you need to have the Chinese on board with any developments in the South China Sea. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. Dr. Singh, on India?
I think China began by being very diffident about multilateral organization. But over a period of time, China has managed to learn the fine art of using multilateral organizations. And ASEAN, which actually has been responsible, the countries of Southeast Asia, which have been responsible for developing a regional organization with unique characteristics, is now seen to be very diffident and cautious. Individual members are very cautious, and that is seen in many actions. And that is why I think what the assessment of my friend from Indonesia is may turn out to be the final reality with regard to COC. And it may be an imperfect document, and partly it is because of the diffidence of Philippines, the diffidence of other members of ASEAN, that they did not take advantage of some of the opportunities that came their way from the legal fold, from the diplomatic fold, they should have utilized those opportunities which came their way, but they did not. As regards your second question with regard to India's whether we are serious about our commitment to the region, I think India is very serious about its commitment. We have, no, it's not just the border issue with China. In fact, sometimes it is compared the kind of doclum that we faced on our borders with the kind of situation that Vietnam has faced in the South China Sea. But what needs to be remembered is that India has certain interests in the South China Sea, which is shown by our company being invested there for so long. And we have a certain policy on maritime issues, and we have been constantly articulating our commitment to the Indo-Pacific region, and that was the last that was told in detail was when our Prime Minister addressed the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018. And that is an indication of where India would like to have this region proceed, what direction it should take.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left for questions. Now I invite people to ask questions. Please keep your questions short and clear. Over there. That's you.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Hubok from Peking University, and I just arrived this afternoon, so I'm sorry for my late. I need to give some contributions to the conference. I think before analyzing the South China Sea situation, we need some common sense. As we know, DOC and COC are not the mechanism between China and ASEAN, but between China and other member states. There are some differences. And the South China Sea arbitration is not the case of a PCA. We should make it very clear. It is not the case of a PCA case. And I also have a question towards Dr. Singh. You have mentioned 2014 incident of the South China Sea between China and Vietnam. Do you have any idea about what's the position of this incident taken place? How far from the position to Vietnam's mainland? Thank you.
Now, we have another question over there. And you're next, okay. And you're next.
Thank you. I have a short question regarding multilateralism. Well, actually, the question is to Mr. Professor Thayer, because from your speech, I think that the problem that you think of the multilateralism in the region is China, and China is the only problem. But I do wanted to say that, well, there's the structural weaknesses of multilateralism, and nobody touched upon that during the panel just now, and it's intrinsic. And also multilateralism in the whole world, all the leaders have the difficulty of getting to, of different values to agree on a common course of action in the whole world. If we look at the ARF, the first meeting was conducted in the year 1994, but so far until now, we still are in the first stage of confidence building and not yet to preventive diplomacy. So it's a problem. I personally don't think the problem is China. And also my question is very simple. Is that according to Professor Thayer, what is your standard of evaluating the effectiveness of multilateral forums in the region? And what do you think is the aim of the current multilateral forums should achieve? Thank you.
At this stage, keep your questions short, please. I want to get all the questions in. Over there, that's Stanley Weeks.
Thank you very much, Les. I just have a comment to make about the paper of our colleague from Malaysia, and that comment basically is that I enjoyed the alternate reality in the movie Yesterday, where John Lennon was still alive and the Beatles never existed, more than I enjoyed the alternate reality in his paper that the South China Sea since 2016 has been a stable, very peaceful, and there's no problem here zone. There's two other things that come to mind. If you look at what's happened since 2016, we've learned some things, notably that you may not be able to buy some countries in this region in ASEAN, but you can certainly rent them. And the other thing we've learned is that it's just as true now as when President Kennedy said it in 1961, that those who try and ride the back of the tiger run a great danger of ending up inside.
Was there a question there, or was that a comment?
Comment.
Comment. Question here, please.
Yes, I have one question about COC.
To whom?
I have one question about COC. Yes, and in fact, that addressed to Professor Thayer and Dr. Singh. And I know that now every country have proposed submit their proposal to the COC. And do you think that China should, because China always have intimidate other countries and force other ASEAN countries to accept their position. So do you think that in this case, China also pressure ASEAN country to accept their position? And the second question is, in case under pressure from China, so ASEAN countries should or should not drop their lawful position and accept China unlawful position. For example, China proposed that preventing country outside the region to cooperate with South Chinese states to exploit the South China Sea resources. Thank you.
Well, Carl, mainly directed to you.
Well, the proposition was China is not the cause of everything, and I'd like to give you a history lesson. When the ASEAN Regional Forum was set up, it had a concept paper. And Dr. Singh showed what was in the concept paper, but not was adopted. Confidence building, preventative diplomacy, and you put conflict resolution. China objected. That could mean interference in its internal affairs. So ASEAN changed that to elaboration of approaches to conflict. So that was watered down. Two, the work program of the ARF back then consisted of intersessional meetings and intersessional groups. That was China. It didn't want anything to be permanent, and it wanted their mandates to be done every year. Now let's go to the year 2004. ASEAN drew up guidelines to implement the Declaration on Conduct of Party. Now I've forgotten whether it's 10, 12, or 15 drafts, and 7 years later, only 2 changes were made. Point 1 in the beginning, where ASEAN started out, was ASEAN should meet together and come on a common position. 7 years later, they caved into China and agreed to promote dialogue. And the only other change was to add at the very end, we'll report what we do to our foreign ministers. So I throw that out, I think, to do. How do I evaluate? Well, in 2002, China agreed to the DOC. It's a political statement. Self-restraint, among other things, not inhabiting features that are uninhabited. Not to undertake activities that would threaten, among other things, but the other things, let's fill in the blanks, that would threaten peace and security, like cruise missiles, surface-to-air missiles, militarizing the building bases, etc. So I think you got my point. Then, of course, if it's not China, then it must be the US, but it took Obama to recognize ASEAN and send an ambassador and deal with ASEAN as a... If you look at how many summits between China and ASEAN, they're 4 times larger than the US summits. And the East Asia Summit just met. No Trump, no Pompeo. So who's creating the particular problem there? So I've given some history lessons where China has intervened. Do I think that China would put pressure on countries in their position? Yes, I do. The Kunming special meeting that I talked about saw China shove a 10-point consensus down ASEAN's throat. And ASEAN stood up to it. They all agreed. We're not going to send to Singapore to the press conference, and we're not going to accept the consensus. That's not what we have. We had China at one point saying Brunei, Laos, and Myanmar had all agreed to a consensus on the South China Sea. And one by one over time, each of those countries denied that was the case, and China had put words in their mouth. So China is playing on that. And I could go on, but I think there's a sufficient number of facts here to indicate from the founding of ARF, that's 1994, okay, to its work program. Your question was, okay, I'll correct your question. You said every country. No, there are 10 ASEAN countries and China. That makes 11. In the single draft negotiating text, Laos and Myanmar made no submissions whatsoever. So it's only 9 plus China, just to make that particular point. They opted out.
Now, a question was partly directed towards you, Dr. Singh. Like to answer?
Yes, I would agree with Professor Thayer about that China is exerting economic pressure. It is constantly through the Belt and Road Initiative. It has a certain kind of approach to the region, and that has particularly led to some of the ASEAN countries who are within that, they have been affected by some of the approaches of China. And this will, I think, have an impact until the ASEAN countries are able to have an approach of dealing with this kind of economic pressure.
Well, that brings the session to a close. Let me conclude by asking you to join me in thanking our panelists in the usual way.